Welcome to Inspace. Welcome to what is the start of something that we hope snowballs. I think I'm a creative. I did fine art back in '92. Some of you weren't born then, but back in '92 when we didn't really have what we call a rich digital economy, I got into CD-ROM publishing in Wardour Street in the early 90s, and fucked that up. Then moved into webby stuff, and in the end ended up in academia, reflecting on the challenges of how we create value as we explore digital systems, technologies, economies, and how we displace, or worse, destroy value. And by that I mean that whatever we do collectively in our sectors, whatever you've done, you're sometimes creating value. Designers are very good at believing they create value. Sometimes they need a social scientist to say, whoa, that's unethical. All right, so this is what we do. So over the last 10 years, we've built something called Design Informatics, which is fascinated in this interplay. The design opportunity to think creatively about what we can do in digital economies, but also understand, and the word informatics means the study of the flow of information, and understand when that displaces. It might displace people, it might destroy trust, and it's always that interplay that we're trying to take more responsibility. So I've got a few colleagues around me who are part of that criticality in the academy, trying to find out when we lurch and we create value, and then how we lurch and, whoa, that's a problem, all right? In many ways, that underpins this idea of do no harm, the central theme to these series. The other thing that we want to do in the academy is we can talk to ourselves. We'll have many seminars, many things in the ivory tower, and increasingly we're trying to, with the help of Nile, is open up the doors to make so the conversation around AI in particular, ethics, is also something we do situated with and in the world. So you won't see me all the time. In fact, I'll probably stop doing this because I'm hoping someone who cares about the worldview comes in to tell us about how AI is affecting them. Because I have a certain view of the world which is somewhat privileged, that I look at the world from my ivory tower, but you guys, forgive me the word guys, but you may well be in it, facing business challenges, ethical challenges, design challenges. And we won't know that unless we talk about it together. So this whole series is about really trying to be porous and understand what we're entering into. There's also, fair to say, a fair bit of naivety. I don't do AI. Some of these people do AI, and Chris is happily naive. But I really also wanted to set up the series so that we as a community can go on a journey admitting we don't know how it works. And we don't know where the threats are and the opportunities. So I'm also hoping that the team are very open, that you bring and you open up about where you see challenges, and that you feel that there's a trusted community to say, I could do with a talk on, I don't know what, on how or what works behind the black box. I could do with a talk on the European legislation that's coming. Do you see what I mean? So this will work because you say, we're struggling, or we're ahead, or we've got a case study. Chances are, as we go through this, there is a steering group somewhere between myself and Design Informatics, and Bronwyn over there. Bronwyn is a journalist, works at the BBC some of the time, but also is a researcher working on AI and implications of publishing. Sarah is director of Nile, and a small but UK-wide design consultancy, strategic design. So again, embedded in projects, while perhaps Bronwyn and I are working through some theory and practice. And then, of course, we've got colleagues across different communities and sectors. So in that between us, we're trying our best to stand this up. But eventually, I need you to come forward with case studies. All right, so the curatorial team are going to say, hey, we'll pick Katrina, Lachlan and Neil tonight, but I could do with people saying, we've got a good case study, and it's in health, and we're ready to talk about it. We're ready to talk about its problems. We're ready to talk about how it wrangled or dealt with things, or ready to talk about how it was wrong. Okay? So you'll have to help us come forward to say, I've got something to say, and I've got a place in that little triumphant. Now, the way that we're going to run this little show is, and we're thinking bi-monthly, so every 2 months or thereabouts. We're going to try and squeeze one in toward the end of November, just before Christmas, so we hope you come back. Very much the idea is we wanted to have 3 provocateurs. I'm not sure they're going to be that provocative, but I'm hoping that they are a little bit kind of challenging us. And those 3 provocations come from 3 different perspectives. So we have a design perspective, always very keen to see that this meetup helps the design community navigate particularly the Gen AI space, the legal, the business, the value creation, but also the value displacement. We also have an academic, so we'll always try and move the theme around to find whether it's, in this case, Lachlan, who's working in law and regulation, whether we then move through to philosophy, moral philosophy, whether we go down to the art college and pull someone out. So we'll always keep pulling someone from the academy. In some ways, they're ahead of a curve, but we're also kind of behind reality as well. So, and then finally, someone from a sector, a business organisation, which is right in the middle of it as well. So those 3 talks are always collisions. And we're going to run them as fast as we can. Sorry, I'll get out of the way in a minute. And we want you to let go. Because what I think happens when you get 3 provocations from 3 different angles is if you just listen, it opens up different questions. It begins to allow you, because when we go to the group exploration, we'll send you back to some tables to say, what's it for? What are the preferred futures, the implications? You actually scramble some of the messages. And in doing so, you open up novel, creative spaces. In that way, it's a bit like a Hadron Collider. Okay, so it works by mixing and forcing you into a position that, who said it, him, her, or him? And you'll mix it up in that respect. So we'll let you have a go at that. We'll do just before the share back, we'll bring the sheets that you've got, and we'll just do a talk back. We'll just play back. As we're collating them, we'll let you at the wine. All right, so we'll do the actual share back. Once we've got the papers, you go and get a glass of wine or pop, and then we'll have a share back and listen to each other's things. And then we'll be done by 5:30, and you can hang around, loiter with intent, or potter home. So again, it needs you to lean in. This is the first one. We did all right, Sarah. I mean, we got it going, and it'll need you to keep snowballing this. But if we can get 6 of these in a year, and we can find people. The last thing to say is that the team, Taras, absolute star. Couldn't have done it without him. So thank you, Taras. The Nile team, helping out, and colleagues who rocked up today, not sure what they're into. Bronwyn leaning in. We don't know, but this happens and it'll work because of you. So, without further ado, let's get going. 3 interesting provocateurs for you, all talking around the idea of unmasking the algorithm. How do we get underneath what we think we're talking about in the context of AI and ethics, the implications through legal design, and also regulation through business. So, without further ado, I'm handing this over to you. Oh, you, sorry.
No, I've got
you got one, that's right.
And
we're going to run concurrently, and you're up.
Okay.
Oh.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Chris, for that fantastic introduction. So I'm Lachlan Urquhart. I'm a senior lecturer in technology law and human-computer interaction. I'm also director of the Regulation and Design Lab and a couple of other research centres here at the university. And what I'll be talking about is the way in which we're starting to see a shift, I think, in terms of legislation and law more broadly, in trying to deal with some of the challenges posed by AI, and in the way that some of the discussions we've been having over the past few years around explainable AI and increasing transparency around these systems, trying to make them less opaque, where the law is trying to formalise some of these requirements into compliance requirements. And I think in some ways changing how we maybe approach these to where it's no longer trying to act virtuously and act in an ethical and moral manner, but more that this is a requirement that the law is pushing. And this has been happening in different domains of law. So we've seen it in things like data protection and information privacy, with things like the General Data Protection Regulation and its requirements for privacy by design. We're seeing it with the new proposed EU AI Act and what it's trying to do around creating a sort of ecosystem of trust in how we build and design and develop AI systems. And I think where this is interesting and where this is provocative is that it is requiring those who are building these systems to think about how they can respond to these different requirements, account for their actions, and ultimately how these are being integrated into existing design practices. So I just want to pull out a few. I'm not going to go into the detail too much, but a few areas where the law is trying to kind of formalise these requirements a bit more. So for a while now, there's been a bit of a debate in data protection law around do we have a right to an explanation, and things that we're seeing in the likes of the AI Act is there's more focus on, well, how do we support human action in context of AI system use, which is a slightly different discussion to being provided an explanation as to how the system works, but how can we think about the collaborative ways in which these systems are being embedded in different contexts of use and what that means in terms of people who have to operate or oversee these. So there's new requirements coming through at the EU level around how do we design for human oversight. There's also a lot of concerns about, with AI systems being very data-driven, how do we put in place better data governance mechanisms in terms of where the provenance of the data is, where has it been coming from, how can we account for potential risks in terms of bias and discrimination. With things like generative AI, there's more discussion around are copyrighted data sets being implicated in these systems, and how do we make sure licensing and things like that are being addressed properly. And in general, you're starting to see, within the AI Act in particular, this kind of tiering of risk where certain systems will face different levels of obligations depending upon how risky they're perceived to be. So for the lowest risk systems, you need to have greater transparency to let people know that they're interacting with an AI system, unless it's obvious from the context. Versus the high risk systems where there's a huge range of design and development requirements for things like different types of biometric sensing systems, or for technologies that might be being used in schools or in safety systems in cars, things like that, where there's a risk to the system and where it's being used, through to prohibitions on certain types of technologies too. And I think where this differs to some of the debates about ethics as well is there's kind of the teeth that come with a lot of these frameworks. You know, there's significant fines. There's particularly things like the Cyber Resilience Act and the AI Act. They're trying to control what can come into the marketplace in the first place and making restrictions. If you're not going to satisfy those requirements, it can't be sold. So where I see a lot of value with this crossover is there's this turn in law to design practice, and trying to think about how do we make sense of some of these requirements and how they change design practices, and looking at the different methods that we maybe have to help think about these. So to me, I think there's a lot of value in the way the design will focus on dealing with kind of very grounded, situated examples of where these technologies may be deployed, thinking about the real lived experiences of people, utilising different kinds of design frameworks like value-sensitive design or participative design, user-centred design, and trying to really get down to the very situated level as to where these things are occurring. So I just wanted to mention a few examples in my own research where we've been kind of trying to do that job of translating the value of design methods and design early ways of thinking to dealing with some of these legal challenges. So we've used things like ideation decks, ideation cards to maybe translate law into a more accessible format. So things like the morality cards, which we've used in workshops with technology developers and different types of organisations to try and map out the value tensions that these systems are posing for ethics. We've done similar work with legal frameworks as well. We've been doing stuff, sort of research through design, using kind of board games for cybersecurity and thinking about, what are the risks of network security and how can we playfully kind of map out, well, these technologies could be at risk. How can we think about the techniques we'd use to secure them, things like that. And just some of the sensitizations that we see in design research around, the human in the loop, the sort of discussions around human-AI interaction and how that may help with some of those discussions I mentioned in the AI Act around human oversight. And also the way in which design research is often looking at the more than human perspective and some of the debates we're seeing about how do we deal with the environmental costs of large language models and generative AI. Again, the new legislation is starting to think about, do we need more transparency there about how much computational resource is being used every time we put in our prompts and get an output as a result. And just the last one, we've been doing some interesting stuff around using speculative design to think about the futures that we maybe want to create or the futures that we want to avoid, and as a sort of critical tool to help us reflect on, is the law actually doing what it should be, and kind of evaluating these with different stakeholder groups. So this report that came out last week, we did some work with law enforcement and sort of stakeholders from that space in terms of regulators and the likes to see, well, if AI systems, live automated facial recognition, emotion recognition, these kind of controversial systems, if they're increasingly going to be used in law enforcement, what kinds of tensions is that going to create? And we used a sort of series of design fictions to situate and ground these emergent technologies to allow those discussions to happen. So that's just some ways in which I feel like the law is turning very much to design, but also design has a lot to offer in terms of how we deal with and understand some of these problems that the law is trying to get design to think about. And if you want to talk more, obviously, be here for the discussions, but that's just some of my details there as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Now, normally we try to let things roll. Are there any questions for clarity? So don't worry about the big questions, or anything that are unclear to qualify anything Lachlan said. If not, we'll move on. But sometimes there's a kind of, what did you mean by that? Because that sometimes gets lost when we do the three. Okay. No, we're good? All right. Without further ado.
Me?
Is it?
Katrina. I think it's me. Was it Katrina?
I think it's Katrina. So over to Katrina to dive straight into some of the sector-specific issues. And thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming. It's great to see you all. My name's Katrina Melton. I'm a senior associate at DLA Piper, which is an international law firm. And my practice area is IPT, which is intellectual property and technology. So I'm very interested in how AI impacts my clients who are looking to me for advice on how they can use technology and how they can do so in compliance with the law. So today I wanted to look at how these areas have been approached so far in the form of regulation and whether that's the right direction or whether we should be looking to challenge those perceptions and maybe look at redesigning the legal system that we have. So looking first of all, what's the challenge for legal systems? Well, for AI, I think it's fair to say that there's, until recently, a lack of regulation. Because for legislators, it's not something that they might readily understand, they might not have experience in it, and focusing purely on Western democracies, the pace of regulation can be really slow. So regulation hasn't kept pace with developments in technology. And then AI decisions are not always intelligible to humans, so there's a lack of transparency and understanding about AI tools. But they are already being used in very widespread manner, which has led to concerns from a lot of pressure groups around privacy, particularly when it comes to things like surveillance and defense. And also, who do we hold accountable when things go wrong? That's kind of what the legal system is often designed to provide for, but it's not something that I think we have a very developed idea of yet. I wanted to speak about the accountability principle because I see it as a key principle of Western regulation, because it's something that's developed from health and safety law. We now see it in a number of different areas. So data protection is one that Lachlan's mentioned. That is very much centered around accountability. We also see it in things like ESG, where businesses have to account for their sustainability goals and whether they're working in an environmentally friendly way. So they have to account to the public, to their shareholders, and to consumers that they are meeting their requirements. So looking at an accountability principle based regulatory system, it generally requires a controller, so a controlling mind of a company, for instance, to demonstrate that they've assessed the risks and taken steps to mitigate such risks. So from a practitioner's perspective, my clients are often asking me what they need to do to demonstrate compliance, and that's generally in the form of, have they undertaken risk assessments? Have they got proper governance in place? So do they have committees, responsible individuals within the company who are tasked with overseeing these things? Have they got good training in place so that everybody within the business understands what their obligations are? And then there are things like the obligation of proportionality, which would be in things like data protection. You should only be using the data that you require and no more. So the bottom line is that the principle of accountability ensures that organizations and persons who are in control of technology are ultimately accountable for their failures. Looking at the UK and European regulatory response to date, I wanted to mention the open letter because I think it's, from a provocative standpoint, very interesting that it's possibly the first time we've seen so many individuals come together and say, we're quite frightened about the direction of travel, and we think that regulators have an obligation at this point to put a stop on things. So they, in March this year, called for a pause on development of AI technology until such point as they felt we had proper regulatory protections in place. Of course, that didn't happen, but I think it's really interesting to look back at that and see where we are coming towards with the EU AI Act. The GDPR and Data Protection Act, I think, demonstrate really well that foundation that is the development from earlier laws towards a more accountability-based regulatory system, because they enshrine those ideas that are being further developed when it comes to more recent AI Act that's coming down the tracks. We also have things like the accountability principles for artificial intelligence, which is a collaborative effort from a number of different organizations who have interest in AI and creating a system that is ethical and accounts for people's use of such technology in a morally correct way. And it's developing a toolkit that will be used to advise governments, regulators, and businesses on how they can safely use the technology. In the UK, the response so far has been possibly more laissez-faire, in that the UK government has released a white paper following consultation. It's called AI Regulation, a pro-innovation approach, which I think shows you that the UK government is mainly focused on how they can develop such technology within the UK and make the UK a place to do business for AI companies, rather than looking at it from, we want to make sure that we're regulating for it. So at the moment, there's no intent within the UK to legislate for AI, but they have indicated in the white paper that should the principles that they've enshrined in it not be followed, then they would be interested in discussing whether a law should be in place. But at the moment, it's very much that they have wanting to set some principles, but it's up to businesses to decide whether they want to follow them. And then turning to the AI Act, which I won't cover in detail because Lachlan has already, but I think it is at the other end of the scale, where it's very much in the line of a regulatory approach, and it's following that accountability principle, in that it has the sliding scale of AI technologies from minimal, which has very little responsibilities, to unacceptable, where you're probably not really meant to go there. And it puts the onus onto those who are in control of AI technology to ensure that they're doing that in a manner that is accountable, that is transparent, that shows that they have thought about it, that they are minimizing the risk to users, and that they are not using AI in a way that is unsafe for the public and for users and for consumers generally. So my provocation to you is, are we doing the right thing with this approach? Is the individual-centric legal framework the right model, where we're focusing on the end users, and whether we're finding the balance between the need for transparency and accountability with the needs of business, like my clients, and for other interests like defense and security. So, and ultimately, with the pace of technology moving so quickly and so fast, is it even possible to properly regulate for the advancement of that technology? Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Stay there. Is there anything for clarity? You won't go deep on questions, but if there's anything for clarity, very clever. I mean, this interplay between your moral guidance, your compass, and regulation. One comes fast, one comes through interaction. You've all probably fiddled with these tools, so you're all complicit. Right. You're all guilty of burning carbon on this. So nothing yet. Okay, thank you so much. Really interesting. Again, you can see, I mean, forgive me doing this segue, but this role, you're all caught up in this boundary. If you're in business, if you're in design, if you're working on the edges, you're trying to find out how you stay in touch to navigate what's right. I hope we want to do what's right or what's good, but maybe we should suspend that. Maybe what good is different for you. I want a good business. I want a good future. Right, our last provocateur is Neil,
Yep.
who is up to his neck in this stuff as a designer. So, over to you.
Thank you very much. My name's Neil Coleman. I'm design director at Nile. My design career started about 20 years ago during the dot-com boom. Is anyone around then? You were, Chris, I know that much. And that was a big shift in design, and crikey, this is a bit different and a bit scarier and a bit bigger. Canary in the coal mine. I want to talk about our lived experience as a design team at Nile and some of the things we're running into day to day around the use of AI technology in the real world. What are we finding challenging? What questions is it throwing up for us? And where do we stand on accountability and transparency when it comes to that? So I'm going to start off by talking about the fuzzy front end of design. What does that mean? It's the bit of design at the beginning where we're trying to triangulate what our customers or users might need, what's a viable business model, and what we can actually build in the real world. In other areas, so healthcare, they're speeding up the process to viable drug discovery through the use of language models, and it's saving a whole lot of time and cost at that beginning stage. In design, we're starting to look at the role of analysing research data to find out what themes, what opportunities should we focus on. The questions we've been asking ourselves is, what are we throwing away by doing that? A huge valuable part of the design process is our lived experience as a design team in understanding the human aspects of the challenges we're operating in, whether that's opening a new bank account or seeing your GP. And by using technology to do some of that for us, we're thinking, well, what are we losing in that process? And does anyone remember throwing their calculators away in a maths exam and having to do it by hand? That was all about you focusing on the actual challenge and the problem to solve and your journey of learning through that process. And by using these tools, are we throwing away something that we'd rather hold on to? So does our lived experience matter when it comes to that early stage of design? The next thing we want to talk about is prototyping. So as part of design process, a huge part of that is understanding, are the solutions we're creating in the world, are they fit for purpose? Do they solve the problems we want them to solve? And should we then implement those solutions? And what we're seeing is that the capability set in the hands of designers through AI is extending dramatically through the use of these tools and technologies. So we can design a user journey, we can write copy, we can even get the tone of voice for a particular brand. Of course, we can generate images, video, you name it. The power centralized into the hands of designers is increasing. How much longer will it take before we can go live into the world with a product? And the process we currently go through to prototype and test changes altogether. So this idea of centralization of power, which we've all probably heard about, we're seeing very starkly in the work that we're doing, and we're seeing it by encroaching on the roles of others. So people whose jobs are to do some of these things and that are being consumed by or could be consumed by designers. Now this one is all about how ChatGPT and other tools is speeding things up for us. Who's used ChatGPT to meet a deadline because they were struggling? Yeah, and that's a blessing and a curse, right? So every year at Nile we go on a team trip where we all collect together and collaborate together, and we usually have a series of tasks and challenges, presentations, research we do as a team. And this year, what was interesting was how widespread the use of AI was to speed up that process. We were using it to generate video scripts, to conduct research around different sectors, to help us present to our colleagues. And as you can see up there, this is one of the images that was part of the presentations we were creating. And this is all about telling the story of Susan, who wants to retire early. As you can see, she's having various degrees of success with doing that. And the interesting thing about this story is you can see, obviously, that these images aren't particularly diverse. We all know that AI is biased. But when we saw it for ourselves in the process of performing these tasks very quickly, we suddenly went, oh, that's what bias feels like when we actually experience it. So the moral of the story is, if we're using these tools to speed us up and we only discover the consequences for ourselves after the fact, is that good enough? Should we slow things down a little bit and be more deliberate in our actions? So hopefully that's given you a little bit of a window of insight into the things that we're running into in our design practice. And the question to the room is, should we be thinking about specific safeguards for design teams, designers, that, let's face it, all the things that we're sitting here with today, bags, phones, whatever it might be, there's a designer or design team, whether with intent or not, that's created that. As the capability that designers have extends, should we be thinking more about slowing things down or not? And that's something that we're definitely, the lived experience of my team and what we're doing is something we're grappling with. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a window of insight into our design world. Back to you, Chris.